Thank you very much, Lord Dear, for your kind introduction, and my congratulations to the Police Foundation for choosing this topic for your conference today. And it's indeed a pleasure to follow Alex and to have caught the tail end of your discussions there. May I also first extend my apologies, or the apologies again, from Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper, who was unable to join today, this afternoon, and she has asked me to pass on her very best wishes for your conference today. I think we are all clear that domestic and sexual violence in Britain is little short of a national scandal, and it is time that our politicians also said so. Women reported over 12 million incidents of domestic abuse last year. At least 750,000 children a year are witnessing violence in their own home, and 2 women a week are killed by their partner or an ex. And it's a crime that we know affects men too, though on a smaller scale. In addition, we know that thousands of girls are at risk of FGM, while others just disappear, becoming victims of forced marriage or honour violence that we have been, in fact, more comfortable turning a blind eye to. These crimes, we know, are a drain on our economy and a blight on our society, and domestic abuse alone costs the UK 15.7 billion a year. Women I have met recently since I took on this role just over a month ago have fled the cities where they've lived and worked, and even been forced to call rough sleepers for help before finding shelter in a refuge. I spoke to a mum living in a safe home with her children. She spent Christmas behind locked doors with alarms after her ex-partner, forbidden from contact, sent a bunch of red roses to confirm where she was before making the journey to go and see her. These will be all too familiar scenarios to everybody here. But I believe that the landscape is changing, and your conference today, looking at innovations in policing and sharing good practice, shows a shift in mindset that has taken place over the last few years in the police, in politics, and amongst the public. Domestic violence is no longer considered to be something that happens just behind closed doors, an issue to be settled within a family. It's widely recognised as a serious crime, and we're now seeing domestic violence storylines in soaps, celebrities endorsing campaigns to tackle it. And now the Labour Party has made tackling it a central issue for a future Labour government by appointing a shadow minister for preventing violence against women and girls. This is a huge shift from the 1980s, when people talked of battered wives and domestic violence was still a civil and not a criminal matter. It's an issue moving from the private sphere much more into the public sphere. And this is also reflected in the thoughtfulness and the insight which the Police Foundation has brought to its work in this area. The Oxford Policing Policy Forum, which you run, is a really important resource for politicians and practitioners to gauge the views of experts from across the criminal justice system. Your report on tackling domestic violence set out the challenges clearly. The level of domestic violence is shocking, but the criminal justice system is not the only answer to addressing this. It spelt out rightly that alongside to reform of policing and the court system, we also need to be looking at breaking the cycles of violence, helping victims rebuild their lives and supporting the thousands of children who witness domestic violence in their homes. And we know that over the last 15 years, we have made progress. We've seen MARIC, specialist courts, IDVAs, and so on. But we know that things are not working as they should. And with the level of incidents that we are seeing each year, with one emergency call relating to domestic abuse being made to the police on average every 30 seconds, it would be wrong to congratulate ourselves on the progress that has been made. Indeed, it would be wrong for me to not stand here and say that we are nowhere near where we should be. We need to put up our hands and say that although progress was made under the last Labour government, it was not nearly enough. And we are concerned that this government has turned the clock back, with more domestic violence being reported, but for 4 consecutive years, prosecutions and convictions have gone down. The HMIC report, Everyone's Business, will not have been easy reading. The report exposed what many of us had heard many times before. The policing of domestic violence is not good enough. Some of the examples cited could be considered negligence. The HMIC found basic operational failures, police not collecting evidence at the scene of domestic violence incidents, not talking to the victim in the separate rooms from the alleged perpetrator, and an often poor understanding of the nature and patterns of domestic violence. There were other issues too. Many police forces have domestic violence set out in their written strategies as a local priority, but this wasn't being seen nearly enough in practice. And there was a lack of visible leadership cited, without clear direction being set by senior officers. Training was limited or not reinforced through management systems for so many officers. And the very limited systematic feedback from victims about their experience of the police was then hard to respond to. And we really need to be questioning and challenging some of the behaviour of police officers who engage with victims. Victims like Kimberly, who was abducted and assaulted by her ex-boyfriend, leaving her with injuries to her face and body. She described the first officer who came to interview her as very inappropriate. She had to suggest that he might want to take some pictures of her injuries because he was more interested in her personal life. He was saying he had a friend in the force who would really like to take a girl like me out. I met a woman in the summer who was treated as being drunk at the scene of her domestic violence incident by the police, when in reality her partner had hit her so hard she was in fact concussed. We get a lot of letters from victims who say the police they talk to often don't seem to take their experiences seriously, something which affects their confidence in coming forward in future. This is both a recurring theme and a vicious cycle. Victims of domestic violence not being taken seriously, and then friends or acquaintances, also victims themselves, who hear these stories, expect similar treatment and so continue to suffer in silence. Fundamentally, there seems to be a disconnect between the experiences of victims and the policing of domestic violence. This is not a crime about single incidents of violence, serious as they may be, but about patterns of control, building fear in the victim and creating barriers to leading a normal life. I welcome the government's consultation on criminalising patterns of behaviour and ensuring psychological and financial control are recognised also as serious crimes. But this is still at consultation and doesn't yet address the serious shortfall in what the numbers of victims demand and how our services are collectively responding. This is what makes your conference and your call for innovations in policing domestic abuse very timely and frankly an important step to moving forward with police forces across the country in addressing the findings of the HMIC report. Stories like Kimberly's are difficult to read and feed into the wider debate about the future of policing. That's why the Labour Party commissioned Lord Stevens to carry out a major commission on policing last year, a royal commission in all but name. We need to maintain public confidence in policing, and although statistics do show this is the case, and the vast majority of the police, and certainly those that I have met in Hounslow and elsewhere, who only seek to do an outstanding job, we know that despite that there are incidents which have a damaging impact on the public's view. The Stevens report recommended a series of changes which Labour is adopting to drive up performance. For instance, scrapping the Independent Police Complaints Commission and replacing it with a new police standards authority, which is able to launch their own investigations into allegations of poor policing, rather than wait for referrals. Inspect forces thematically and force change. For these police forces whose failures have been pointed out in numerous IPCC investigations, this will mean real and immediate reform. Policing is one of the most important jobs in our country, and Labour want to recognise this by creating a chartered police officer, which will involve registration with the College of Policing and give access to continuous professional development. I think this follows neatly on from the conversation that you have just had. And we would hope that membership of this organisation would confer the highest standards of professional development. Key to this is the fact that as in nursing, or if you are a GP, if you are found to have committed serious misconduct, you can be struck off the list of chartered police officers. So for Kimberly and other victims of domestic violence treated poorly by the police, there could be real routes for recourse. But there is no point in having a world-class police system, policing standards, and those improving if we don't improve the criminal justice system as a whole and victims' experience of the court system. And at the moment, we know that it isn't working. I am sure that you, like me, have heard from victims who feel their abuse is perpetuated and prolonged through the protracted court system. Victims who have faced incredibly intensive interrogations by defence lawyers, reliving their experience, often face-to-face with their abuser. Or those whose cases have been delayed again and again, who are now forced to pay out for the protection they need against very violent men. Not long ago, I heard from Charlotte. Charlotte was first attacked by her husband 15 years ago, shortly after her daughter was born. For years, she was subject to physical, psychological, and sexual assaults. Sometimes her children were also subject to the abuse. In April last year, there was a particularly violent incident and Charlotte was badly injured. She reported this to the police, who captured evidence and charged her husband with assault. When the trial came round, she found her husband had persuaded her 14-year-old daughter to give evidence claiming no attack had taken place. Scared and worried she'd never see her dad again, she said Charlotte had made the incident up. The violence continued and worsened. Charlotte describes feeling sick to her stomach when she returned home from work each evening. He would keep her awake at night by shining a torch in her eyes, throwing water over her and shouting abuse. He raped her many times and cut chunks of her hair. He took naked photos of her and threatened to send them to her boss. She eventually fled her home and went to her sister-in-law's, taking her children with her, and contacted the police, who charged him with assault. He broke his bail order multiple times. Despite her injuries and witnesses to one of the assaults, the CPS decided there was not enough evidence to take her case to court. She is now pursuing a non-molestation order through the civil courts. As she has a job, she is being forced to fund her own legal costs, while her husband, who is unemployed, is eligible for legal aid. This is not good enough, which is why Labour has asked Keir Starmer to draw up a new victims law, which will give victims a greater stake in our justice system. This is due to be published next month and will be an important step in taking forward the real progress we need to see in how we protect and treat vulnerable victims and witnesses in our criminal justice system. So how, in other ways, can we move forward? We can't pretend that politicians have all, or indeed most of the answers. We need to be working with you, listening to you, and doing what we can to support your vital work. We can't pretend we're going to have significantly more resources to look and work through the problems, because we're not. We need to be looking at existing resources and using them better, and working differently and sharing best practice. And in this, when I was talking with my colleague Jack Dromey, Shadow Policing Minister, what was clear is that some of the great examples from around the country of innovative thinking, whether Northumbria, Essex, Lambeth, Manchester, there are innovations that have come from closer working between the police and other agencies, and innovative ways in which information sharing and early intervention supports more effective outcomes. In Ipswich, some innovative work on Suffolk Police's prostitution strategy came about in wake of the Ipswich murders, working together on a joint action plan which all agencies were engaged with meant that they could break down that siloed approach to the sex trade and address better women's safety. And by encouraging those joined up and coordinated approaches, empowering the police also to work with other agencies, they were able to make a positive impact on women's safety. I mentioned that the Labour Party has made preventing violence against women and girls a key priority for government. And earlier this year, Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper announced that a Labour government would bring in legislation to give better support to victims of violence and bring perpetrators to justice. Some of the measures we have suggested proposing are introducing a new commissioner on domestic and sexual violence to sit at the heart of government and ensure victims' voices are being heard. New national standards for policing to drive up performance across the board, because too often police performance is patchy. We need minimum standards so victims can be assured that a reported incident will be dealt with within an allotted time and evidence will be collected. That victims will be kept informed also of how a case is progressing, and that CPS advice will be sought early to help build a case. These are all vital to maintaining that police confidence in policing that we all so desperately want. Introducing compulsory sex and relationship education in state-funded schools from Key Stage 1, so that young people are taught that no form of violence in relationships is acceptable. 88% of parents want sex and relationship education to be compulsory to help tackle those dangers of pornography, which we know are really affecting the lives of young people, and particularly young boys and their behaviour. 86% of UK adults want SRE to be compulsory to tackle sexual consent and respectful relationships. We're also saying that we would introduce a £3 million annual fund for refuges, supporting victims of domestic violence, because we know that refuges now are so desperately close to closure and we need to protect them. We're also calling for new FGM protection orders to stop children being suspected, who are suspected at being at risk of FGM, from being taken abroad, with the impact that being cut will have on the rest of their lives. And we'll introduce other measures from our Women's Safety Commission, led by Vera Baird QC, who I'm delighted is here today, and Diana Holland. I want to just say a few words in closing, that this is a long journey which requires leadership from politics, leadership from our public services, and leadership from within our communities. But in taking forward this offer, we will be working closely with those engaged in support services and in the justice system. There is clearly no single answer to how we tackle violence against women and girls. It won't be solved by politicians or the police alone. Instead, it needs a coalition of supporters: police, teachers, parents, children, and young people, doctors, nurses, women's groups, to really challenge a culture in which violence against women is not swept under the carpet or hidden behind the net curtains. Learning from you about the impact of innovations, as well as the barriers that you identify in tackling domestic abuse, will see us move forward on a pathway to a world where domestic abuse, at least on the scale that we have come to see it, will become a matter of the past. It's a challenge that we must rise to, and I very much look forward to working with you. Thank you.